In this episode of Motive Garage presented by Sparesbox, we finished the plumbing and wiring for our 8-second R32 GTR and get it up and running again.
It's been a little while since we've had an update on our R32 Skyline GTR. Now, as you know, the build snowballed to get it ready to send to America for the 2024 GTR Festival USA. Now, combine that with the fact we had the biggest and busiest GTR festival in Australia we've ever had. We've been super busy, and a lot of the work on this car happened late at night off camera. It's been a bit difficult to give you an update. So in this episode, we're going to run you through what's happened and give you an overview of how the car sits now before we talk about its plan and obviously getting it to America.
At the end of the last episode, the car was dropped off to Croydon Racing Developments for some fabrication work. We needed new intercooler piping to suit the V2 inlet manifold, and we made all the connections Hypertune clamps and changed to red TurboSmart race port blower valve. We also had to modify the Patterson dry-sump tank to suit the PRP dry-sump system, which includes an oil-air separator. Our testing and feedback will be used in future production of dry-sump tanks for the PRP Billet Dry-Sump Kit. We also fabricated a hard line for the spew tank breather, which incorporates a drain plug. Important, as oil can pool when you shut the car off, and when mixed with ethanol can cause a sludge and block the tube. With all the fab work done, we got on to finishing the oil and fuel lines, all supplied by Raceworks with Rob from Cranked Motorsport. We needed to mount an oil cooler, and this time we went for one of the best money can buy from Motorsport Connections. Rowan also got started on the wiring with some trial fits and adjustments, plus the usual extras that we always work out we need along the way.
I thought I was done probably 2 weeks before we got to that point of before GTR Festival. It felt like we were very, very close, but then we got to the thought of going, okay, let's get through. Let's get power mirrors to work. Let's get power windows to work. Let's get the interior light working. Let's make this actually feel like a street car and get through those fancy things as well. And they may be simple things, but they're real time-consuming ones that you just really got to take time to get right, make sure they will work over and over again, because you want those sort of creature comforts when you are driving a car like that. That's the horn we were talking about. Next time we'll get him a real horn.
We also sent off the dry sump tank for anodizing at Platinum Racing Products and the intercooler pipes to be powder coated at Boutique Wheels, formerly Produced Factory. We also mounted a tank warmer from P1 Australia to help with warm-up. The final look matches the multi-grey of the outside with red highlights, tying in the red brakes and interior trim. We managed to get the car running before GTR Festival and get it to Croydon Racing Developments to put in an initial tune so we could drive it for a little while and check everything works as it should before the final tune and turn up the power. Over 800 horsepower is the least we can make, as it was done on wastegate pressure. The gate opens at 10 psi and creeps up to around 20, giving a linear power graph and a very drivable car. Needing to drive the car for a little bit, combined with how busy we were and no time for testing, meant the decision was made not to race at GTR Festival Australia and instead focus on getting the car ready to take to the USA.
So now the car is running, driving and ready for final tuning and wheel alignment. Speaking of wheel alignment, we're about to send the car over to DNA Autosport to set up the new Shockworks coilovers, including corner weighting and alignment. But in the meantime, I'm going to show you guys around the car so you can see its current setup before we get it ready to go to the USA. Let's go. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that this engine bay is chalk and cheese compared to what it used to be. In fact, let's put it up on the screen now. It was always a hodgepodge, constant state of evolution engine bay. It had sections of factory wiring loom still left over, and engines in and out for a decade. means that the engine bay, well, wasn't that healthy. So this time we did it right, and we built it as if, we built it in one go. We completely stripped the engine bay and painted it, so it's all fresh gloss paint thanks to Brian El Hassan before we started putting it together. A lot of the combination isn't drastically different to before. It's either just been tidied up or improved in small ways. The engine itself is still the same RB30 block half grout filled, prepped by PRP, Nitto wide journal 3.2 stroker crank, obviously with Nitto rods and pistons. That hasn't changed at all. It got fresh bearings. The head got disassembled and cleaned, nothing wrong with it, went back together, and that's a CRD race ported head, 1mm oversized valves from Supertech double valve springs, titanium retainers, and a camshaft choice from Croydon that is, well, pretty big, over 290 degrees and 11.85mm lift, and still have the PRP billet cam covers on top. So the engine itself is relatively straightforward. We haven't gone to billet yet. We wanted to push the cast a little bit further. Plus, the moment you go billet block, everyone thinks you're going to run 7s. But really going billet block for me would have been more about reliability and not ever having to worry about cracking the block. So the Garrett G45, the super core and compressor haven't changed, but I have gone to a 128 rear housing. We did find that when you have a 101 twin scroll housing, back pressure became an issue, above 30 pound of boost right at the last sort of 1000 RPM in the rev range, and we'd pretty much maxed out that turbo on 32 pound to go 860 at 165. I don't necessarily want to make a heap more power, it's more about just making that power more reliably. A lot of people are going to say, what about drivability and boost response? Well, my first drive of the car, I actually just can't tell the difference that it has a 128 down in first and second gear. Brand new K&N filter, powder coated intake. The dump pipe and rear housing have now been ceramic coated. It's all new intercooler piping that got powder coated in the Nardo grey. It actually matches JETRH9's engine bay as well. The Hypertune 4-inch intercooler is the same as before, but we now have Hypertune clamps everywhere. We switched to a Hypertune V2 inlet manifold. This isn't going to change anything compared to the V1 inlet. It's just a lot neater, but obviously we had to remake all of the water cooling lines because this hasn't got the built-in water cooling line and water neck that goes to the radiator. Underneath the inlet manifold, we used a PRP silicon radiator pipe, which basically joins all the water outlets together so that we can have a normal radiator tube, and we had to weld in the water temperature underneath. The PWR radiator is the same as before, but we modified one of the Hypertune twin thermo fans. We had to do this because the dry sump actually doesn't fit with our old Spow thermo fan, the big single 16-inch. So now we have two 11-inch Spow thermo fans, and honestly, these flow just as good, if not better. And we have all the ducting and shroud from Hypertune as well. Did require some modifications to fit it all with the dry sump, etc. But the PWI radiator is the same as before, and obviously powder coated. It's the same header tank here, but we did do all new lines from Raceworks to be able to bleed that cooling system. Let's now look at the fuel system. We switched to a Hypertune fuel rail because the PRP rail doesn't work with the Hypertune V2 inlet, so we didn't have much of a choice. The mechanical fuel pump is the same as before, but we switched to a twin outlet, which enabled us to make the lines a lot neater than they were before. And we've still got the FPR 10 Pro, which is the mechanical fuel pump specific fuel pressure regulator from TurboSmart, and we've got IDX 2400cc injectors. Best thing about the IDX injectors is they essentially from scratch are designed to work on low capacity engines and still idle normally and have good drivability down low, but obviously can flow a lot of power. And 2400 is, well, it's pretty much what you need with one of these. Ignition system, we've switched to the PRP IGN1 R35 coil. Basically, these bolt into the same position as an R35 coil, so you're a direct replacement, but obviously are a larger, more powerful coil. They're probably actually overkill for this car, but whatever, right? We've switched to a PRP Pro trigger kit. You can see up here, we obviously chose all the colors to match. Speaking of colors, you can see the anodizing in gray is different to obviously the other grays. It's impossible to match anodizing up across different materials. You can't see the Pro trigger kit down the bottom, but it is there. It's the 36 tooth one for better resolution because we like to rev this thing well past 9,500 RPM. Now while we're here, just looking at the brakes, it's just been cleaned up a little bit. We still have the line locker installed, and we run a vacuum pump in this car because such a large camshaft can struggle with vacuum at time. You also notice we have a clutch booster delete for our clutch from PRP, which you need room for clearance for the inlet manifold. In terms of sensors, obviously there's a lot of work involved with Rowan rewiring the car from scratch. You can see how much neater just this one wiring loom that's all been spiraled is across the back. A lot of it's hidden. It's a bit messier underneath than what you can see, but obviously we have to hide things somewhere. Drive-by wire is here, 6 EGTs. We have an exhaust back pressure sensor, obviously intake air temperature sensor. We have 2 oil pressure sensors. We actually have one coming out of the oil pump pre-Clearview filter and one coming into the engine. That'll let us know if we build up any restriction in either the lines, the oil cooler or the Clearview filter. The Clearview filter is a pretty important modification to the car. Lets us monitor the condition of the oil, bearing wear, or if something has gone wrong, and we can check it out. So yeah, completely rewired, completely refabricated, completely redone. You can see the top of the dry sump tank here. We've added 2 extra lines on this. The reason being is obviously we need a line that comes from the outlet of the pump, which returns oil into the tank, but you also need to breathe out of the oil air separator. So we need an extra line for that, and then one of the lines from the cam cover has to breathe into here also. You notice we don't have a separate catch cam, we don't have any separate breathers on the engine. It just breathes out of the cam cover into the tank. And then obviously from within this tank, it needs to breathe back to the spew tank as well. So that's why there's so many lines on the top of our dry sump oil tank. We run a hard line to the back of the car to make life a little bit easier under the car. But because we run that spew tank breather underneath the car, we have to make sure that we have a drain on it so that you can obviously let the oil out that may pull up when you shut the car off. So a lot of work has gone in here. Let's jack it up and take a look underneath. So short of putting the car on a rotisserie and making it all brand new, underneath is as good as it's ever going to look under a Skyline GTR. The centerpiece is the PRP billet sump. What is this? Well, it's an integrated dry sump that is basically means the pump is attached directly to the sump rather than separated from it from a bracket and having to fabricate lines from the sump to the pump itself. This saves a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it also means the way they channel the oil through the sump is much improved. We have a totally separate video on how that works. On the back is the oil air separator, which stops frothing of the oil going into the tank. And you've got the pulley on the front that means we have to switch to an ATI balancer. There was nothing wrong with our old balancer, it's just that this kit uses an ATI balancer. You'll notice it's pretty tight to our radiator, and that's because we have a 70mm radiator, which is massive. I wanted that to be able to drive on the street, the circuit, and have some fun with this car. So Steve at CRD had to do some clearancing to get it all to fit. You'll also notice up here a PRP water pump pulley and a PRP alternator pulley attached to an LS1 alternator. Factory GTR alternators are absolute rubbish. They do not put out enough amps to suit highly modified GTRs and all the current that they draw in all the different systems. The LS1 alternator means we've now got the best voltage we've ever had in the car. It's always at 14 volts and is super consistent. The other thing with the billet sump is we have the billet front differential that is now 2 pieces away from the sump. If you know anything about GTRs, the front diff housing is attached to the sump. It's all cast together. If you put a rod out, it's all in the bin. If you crack the sump, it's all in the bin. If you break the front diff housing, it's all in the bin. Now, if you damage anything on this part of the sump, this part stays intact. There's a Quaife LSD inside this put together by Sean from Gearbox Masters, who does all of our gearbox and differential work. So yeah, this red anodized dry sump is an absolute piece of art and pretty much defines underneath this car. There is one thing that we had, and that is this was originally designed with a billet block, but we have a PRP engine block brace in there, which means there's a couple of little bits on the car that just require a little bit of finessing to get it to fit perfectly. If you have a billet block though, no issues. Another thing we also had to do was work with PRP to design a whole new front sway bar to clear out the dry sump pump, and as you can see, that clears that perfectly. Our car was used for testing of all that. We switched to a billet engine mount on this side. The reason we did that is no matter what brand of engine mount you put in, on the passenger side, you will break it. Our engine mount was broken. If you look up under here, you can also see that we have a notched engine mount to fit the 6-boost exhaust manifold for RB30. Yes, that is a known thing and everyone knows about it. A lot of new lines under here. As you can see, all the plumbing going back from the sump to the dry sump tank. Also note that there's a drain here and a drain here, so when you do change your oil, you've got to change both. Another thing to look at under here is the surge tank for the fuel system. If you have a mechanical fuel pump, you have 2 options. If you run it at the front, you need a tank at the front. You put the tank at the back and you just get fuel pressure issues, which we did have with this car. So we had two choices, surge tank at the back, but then we would have to put the mechanical fuel pump at the back and run a cable. So we decided to put the fuel tank up the front. In terms of safety, it passes scrutineering at the events that we go to, and that's what matters. It's not driven on the street too much, and it's a pretty solid unit up the front. So don't stress out, it's all been thought about. So what else is there to see under here? Let's take a look at the suspension. Shockworks coilovers are new to this setup. The Teen Super Streets we're used to having the car are out, and Chris has built something to suit this car to be able to be driven on the street and go drag racing. It is sort of a in-the-middle combination to keep the car as an all-rounder. We have JETRH9 lower control arms. We have Teen adjustable caster rods. And what is difficult to see but very important in this car is we have the JETRH9 roll center adjuster, which is a spacer between the knuckle and the lower control arm. JETRH9 tie rod ends, JETRH9 bump steer adjusters. This is all done to correct the geometry for A, having the car lowered from factory, although ours isn't ridiculously low, and B, it's there because there is a subframe spacer that brings the subframe down 9 millimeters, but we have 20 millimeters here. So essentially it's helped us counteract the subframe spacer and also counteract some of the lowering. Our motto with this car is when it's statically sitting on the ground, the lower arms should be level front and rear to give us the right suspension and travel and camber curve that we want for the car, and it's always worked really well for us. Let's move down, take a look at the drivetrain and a couple of new things down the back. So moving down the car, you can see the 4-inch dump pipe that also has a flapper valve and screamer pipe. Believe it or not, we actually didn't use the flapper valve when we made 1100 horsepower and went 8.6 at 165. But generally, I open the valve in a car park so the car sounds cool. The rest of the exhaust is you've got a 4-inch stainless center section with a flex, and then basically from the back of the gearbox back is all vibrant 4-inch titanium with a 4-inch titanium muffler as well. Drivetrain wise, we still use a direct clutch twin plate, but now we've switched to a sintered iron unit. The 9-inch sport or street clutch that we had in the car was fantastic. It held the power no problem, drove fantastic on the street. You all saw the videos, but the problem was after multiple launches at the track on a drag radial, that clutch is just not designed for that. So when you want to go drag racing on a drag radial and be able to do multiple runs back to back on the same day, you need to switch to a sintered iron clutch. RHM has used this clutch to go 7.6 in his R34 GTR at over 180 miles an hour. So yeah, we know it can cop a fair bit of abuse and cop a lot of power. So that's why we've put that in the car. We want it to be reliable in the US. You saw in a previous video, we switched to a PPG 6-speed sequential transmission. This thing is awesome. Has 2 different speed sensors inside the box, a condition sensor, gear position sensor, and strain gauge. So there's a lot of wiring for Rowan to put in, but this thing drives fantastic. We've now got throttle blip on downshift. Obviously we got flat shift for full throttle shifts, and we've set it up so that basically how it shifts changes based on RPM, boost, and throttle position to keep it nice and smooth to drive on the street. These things are fantastic when set up properly. The transfer case is a freshly built one, and if you look at the back of the transfer case, JMA Automotive sent us one of their output drive shaft speed sensors, because obviously we don't use the cable speedo, use the cherry sensor and a disc, pretty straightforward. What you can also see on the back here is we had to install a pressure sensor for the transfer case now that the factory Atessa ECU isn't being used and the Haltech is controlling the four-wheel drive. The pressure sensor on the transfer case gives feedback back to the ECU of what's happening within the four-wheel drive system. Even without making any adjustments so far, it actually works pretty good on the street. We also replaced the pressure line from the pump to the transfer case over to one of these Frenchies Performance Garage lines. These bolt straight on, but the main reason we got it is it has an adapter here that puts a 1/8 NPT port so that you can put the pressure sensor into the back of the gearbox. Something that might surprise a lot of people is we still use a 2-piece factory tail shaft. That's right, our front drive shafts, our rear drive shafts, our tail shaft, our front prop shaft are all OEM, and they've all been in the car for, well, who knows, probably since factory. I think the very most we've done is change some CV boots and get them freshened up. But yeah, it is all factory shafts went 860 at 165. But now that I've said that, guaranteed they're going to break on the next pass. So, but our attitude has been, I'm not going to replace them until they break and need replacing. When will that be? Who knows, right? It's all about how you drive, how you look after it, your driving technique, and I guess how many passes the thing has done. So one thing that would surprise a lot of people is that additional to the stock rear drive shafts, we actually ran the stock R200 differential with the stock LSD for over a decade. Literally only just started wearing out recently, and we've now installed a two-way mechanical LSD into the car. The reason I put a CAS two-way in is just quite simply because, well, I had one here ready to go. Obviously, if this breaks, we'll be switching over to the PRP Billet 8.8-inch diff, which obviously uses much larger drive shafts. I think the thing you need to understand is we only went 1.48 in the 60 to do our 8.6. If we go into the 1.3s, there is no way the rear diff and the shafts are going to break. I have found that it's not so much power as such that breaks the rear end in these cars. It's just how hard the car does the 60 foot. If you're only doing 1.5s, 1.6s, etc., you won't be breaking these unless you're just dumping the clutch and shock loading them. But once you go into the 1.3s, it is what it is, and we're probably going to break it. Suspension-wise, Shockworks rear coilovers. We just use adjustable camber arms, Hycus lock bar. We have a white line rear sway bar, which does help with controlling the power down when the car wants to squat. It doesn't want to go to one side too much. Lower arms are factory with bushes in it. And that's it. One cool little thing I like is we actually have our oil drain and breather for the spew tank hidden under the rear bar here, which is a pretty cool place to put it and out of sight. Let's have a look in the boot now, what's changed in there. So the boot, or the trunk for our American friends, is still a little bit of a work in progress. Everything we need to be in there is in there. It just does need a little bit of tidying up, but we haven't done that yet because there's so much we had to do in here. We wanted to make sure it all worked perfectly before we do the final finish up before it goes to the USA. But I'll run you through what's here. Frenchie's Performance Garage fuel hat, which obviously has the AN fitting bulkheads and better wiring posts, and obviously the whole car's been rewired. You have the see-through cover, which is pretty cool. That goes up to a Turbo Smart fuel filter, as well as a new Haltech flex fuel sensor before it goes through bulkheads to act as essentially the feed line to the surge tank in the front of the car. The factory Atessa reservoir is still here. The factory pump is still above the diff, but as you know, we now use the Haltech controller instead of the factory Atessa. Croydon Race Developments fabricated this awesome spew tank. Now, a spew tank for a dry sump isn't just a tank. It basically is an oil air separator as well. It's trying to separate oil and air so that when it does breathe out through the breather line, it's just breathing out vapor. It doesn't spit oil out. We've also added a drain to the bottom of it, so as it fills up after drag runs, you can empty it every pass. We've got a lightweight Mega Life battery. These things are awesome. Astra Power steering pump hidden away in the corner there. People do ask, with the electronic power steering being at the back, is there a delay going to the front? Well, once the system is filled with pressure, it doesn't matter. The only thing is when you start the car, you have to allow a couple of seconds for pressure to make it all the way up and sort of build pressure in the whole system. But unless you're starting the car and trying to turn and take off all at once in a hurry, there's no issue. You can also see the cage work in here. CS Engineering did. The rear main hoops go to the back here, and then they're reinforced into the chassis with, I guess, an X-brace or whatever you want to call it. And then we have the post that goes out through behind the number plate, which flips up, and you can put our parachute in the back. Now, the last thing to check out is the interior. So the interior hasn't changed a whole lot. We still have our CS Engineering roll cage. You can see our parachute lever here, and our retrimmed Velo seats, thanks to Danny at Concept Garage. The red diamond stitching. The PPG 6-speed sequential billet option does have a different gear lever with the button on top for the reverse lockout, but we still were able to use our gear surround trim to go in here. One really cool thing I have changed on the car now is the Wend Lab digital gauges. So basically, when you put an aftermarket ECU in, sometimes the gauges in here don't work very well. They don't read high enough, but if you have a look at this, start this up. This is now a digital gauge set, and check this out. This is the Garage Active and Greddy branded setup, and you can see here you've got oil temperature, water temperature, and boost pressure, but you can actually use the app in your phone to go through and change all of these parameters, change the look. You can have white face, you can have Nismo, factory, etc. Some people love having, I guess, the factory look but digital. So these Wend Lab digital gauges are freaking awesome. Don't know why I have this here anymore, because, well, I don't even have a heater box, let alone aircon, let alone anything else, because the whole dash got stripped underneath and got completely rewired. You can see we put the keypad for the Haltech over here, and we still run the Haltech IC7 digital dash recessed into the Mako Motorsport surrounds. All of the instruments and all of the electronics in the car now are all completely aftermarket. Nothing original works anymore. We also have the Haltech trim pod over here, and we still have our Momo removable steering wheels. Everything's modern, and the greatest thing that we changed in the electronics is still this. It's a clown car horn. I don't know, there's something funny about having a clown car horn on a car that makes 1200 horsepower. Truth be told though, he's sent my worker to get a horn, and that's what he came back with, and now it stays. So yeah, interior is, well, it's still street car-ish. Fixed bucket seats, roll cage and a parachute handle obviously make it a little bit race car, but overall the seats are relatively comfortable. The suspension's comfortable enough to drive, and having all of these gauges and all these, they've still got indicators and lights and all that sort of stuff, as it should for legality reasons for driving. But yeah, the keypad has the exhaust bypass switch, the all-wheel drive switch, the line locker, hazards, wipers, lights, data logging, etc. So yeah, everything we need for this car is in here, but I wouldn't exactly go calling it a luxury street car. Well, there you have it. In our next episode, we're going to show you the suspension setup at DNA Autosport. Before we get into final tuning and testing, get the car in a container and send it to America for the PRP GTR Festival USA at Texas Motorplex on November 15th to 17th. What other cars are going to be joining me as part of Team Australia? Well, you're just going to have to keep your eyes and ears peeled on the GTR Festival website and social pages to see who else is coming. But I can tell you this, the world's quickest GTR has to go, right? So make sure you head to the GTR Festival website, which is simply gtrfestival.com. Get your tickets, get your entries, and any more information you need. See you there.